All right, everyone. Welcome to week 5 of HTL 312. This is where things start to shift a little bit in the course. Up until now, we've been focused heavily on ethics, how to think through situations, how to apply principles like beneficence and non-malfeasance, and how to make decisions when things get complicated. Now we're layering something on top of that, and that something is law. And just to set expectations, this is not a law school class, I promise. I'm not turning you into attorneys. But what we are doing is helping you understand when your actions, especially in the lab, move from being just a mistake into something that could have legal consequences. Because whether you realize it or not, everything you do in the lab exists within a legal framework. And yes, that includes embedding, cutting, staining, labeling, all of it. Great. First things first. You made it past exam 1. Congratulations. Take a second and appreciate that. That was a lot of foundational material, and you now have something really important, a solid ethical foundation. You understand how to think through situations, not just memorize definitions, and now we're building on that. This week is not starting over, it's adding a new layer. And that layer is law. Think of it like this. Ethics gave you your decision-making framework. Law is going to give you your boundaries. And sometimes those two line up beautifully, and sometimes they absolutely do not. And that's where healthcare gets interesting and occasionally stressful. This slide right here is probably one of the most important mindset shifts of the entire course. Ethics tells you what you should do. Law tells you what you must do. And those are not always the same thing. You can absolutely be in a situation where you feel like something is ethically right, but it may not align with legal requirements. Or something is technically legal, but feels completely wrong ethically. In that tension, that's real healthcare. Now bring that into the lab. Let's say you're behind, you're stressed, and someone says, just go ahead, it's probably fine. Ethically, you might feel uneasy. Legally, if something goes wrong, probably fine is not going to help you. That's the space we're stepping into this week. Let's talk about why this actually matters, especially for you. Healthcare is heavily regulated. This is not a do your best and hope it works out kind of profession. There are rules. There are standards. There are expectations. Patients are protected by law, which means every process in healthcare, including lab work, is designed to protect them. And here's the part students sometimes underestimate. Professionals are held accountable. Yes, including you in the lab. Even though you may never meet the patient, even though you're behind the scenes, your work directly impacts diagnosis, treatment decisions, and patient outcomes. So if something goes wrong, like a mislabeled specimen or incorrect processing, it's not just a technical issue. It can become a legal issue. That's why this matters. So here's what I want you to walk away with from this lecture. Not memorization, but understanding. By the end of this, you should be able to explain where laws actually come from, because they don't just magically exist, how law applies to healthcare, and more importantly, how it applies to your role. What negligence actually means, not just the definition, but how it plays out in real situations, and probably most important for you, how legal responsibility shows up in the lab, because it does. Every time you accept a specimen, verify patient information, follow or don't follow a protocol, you are operating within a legal framework. So as we go through this, I want you constantly asking yourself, where would this show up in my day-to-day lab work? That's where this content really clicks. This is one of those slides I really want you to internalize. You do not need to be a lawyer. No one is expecting you to walk into a lab and start quoting case law or arguing legal precedent. But you do need to recognize when something could become a legal issue. And here's where students sometimes get tripped up. Legal issues in healthcare rarely start as big dramatic events. They usually start small. A label that's a little unclear, a shortcut that everyone takes, a step that gets skipped because you're behind. And in the moment, it feels minor. But legally, well, those small decisions can build into something much bigger, especially if harm occurs. So your job is not to be a lawyer. Your job is to develop that internal radar that says, wait, this could go sideways. Because catching it early is what protects you, your lab, and your patient. Now we're officially shifting into the what is law portion of the lecture. And I like to pause here for a second because most people think they know what law is, but they've never really broken it down in a healthcare context. So this section is going to give you a foundation, not just definitions, but how law actually functions in the real world. And more importantly, how it shows up in your environment. Because again, we're not learning law in isolation. We're learning, how does this apply to me standing at a grossing station or at a microtome or embedding at 4:30 when I'm tired and just want to go home? That's where this becomes real. So let's define it in a way that actually makes sense. Law is a system of rules that exists to maintain order, protect individuals, prevent harm, and provide consequences. And I want you to notice something here. Every single one of those connects directly to healthcare, especially prevent harm. That is a huge theme in both ethics and law. Now bring this into the lab. When you follow procedures, you're maintaining order. When you're verifying patient identifiers, you're protecting individuals. When you follow protocols, you're preventing harm. And when something goes wrong, that's where consequences come in. So law is not some abstract concept. It is built into every single thing that you do. Now let's narrow this specifically to healthcare. Why does law exist here? First, to protect patients. Patients are often in vulnerable positions. They rely on systems working correctly, including the lab. Second, to define standards of care. This is huge. Law helps establish what is considered acceptable practice. Not your personal best, not your coworker's habit. The standard. Third, to regulate professionals. Licensing, certifications, scope of practice, all of that comes from legal structures. And finally, accountability. If something goes wrong, there has to be a system in place to investigate, determine responsibility, and address harm. And again, this includes laboratory professionals. Even though you may not interact with patients directly, your work is still part of that legal framework. Okay, this is where things get interesting. Ethics and law are related, but they are not the same thing. Ethics is flexible, value-based, and sometimes subjective, meaning reasonable people can disagree. Law is required, enforceable, and has consequences attached, meaning you don't get to interpret it your own way when it comes to compliance. Now let's bring this into a lab scenario. Ethically, you might think, I want to help move things along. We're busy, patients are waiting. But legally, If you skip a required step and something goes wrong, that's not an ethical debate anymore. That's a legal problem. So as you move forward in healthcare, you constantly need to balance what feels right and what is required. And sometimes those are not the same thing. All right, this is one of those slides where I want you to pause and really think, because this is where healthcare and honestly, life gets complicated. Something can be ethical but illegal, or something can be legal but unethical. And that is where things get messy. Let me give you a lab mindset example. You might feel ethically that helping a coworker just push something through is the right thing to do. You're being helpful, you're being a team player. But if that action violates policy or regulatory standards, well, that's illegal. On the flip side, something may be completely legal, say within policy, within regulation, but still feel wrong. And here's the key takeaway. Ethics asks, is this right? The law asks, is this allowed? And in healthcare, you don't get to ignore either one. That tension is something you will navigate your entire career. Okay, let's bring this down to something very real and very relatable. Cutting corners to save time. We've all seen it. Some of you may have already been in environments where this happens. So let's break it down. Is it ethical? Probably not, because you're potentially compromising accuracy, safety, or patient outcomes. Is it legal? Well, that depends. If that shortcut violates a standard, policy, or regulation, then yes, it can absolutely become a legal issue. And here's the part I want you to remember. Is it risky? Always. Because even if nothing goes wrong this time, if something does go wrong later, that shortcut becomes very important. Now think about histotech specifically. Skipping proper fixation times, not verifying identifiers carefully, or rushing embedding or sectioning. Those may feel like small time savers, but they can lead to diagnostic errors. And that's where ethics and law collide. So now that we've talked about what law is and how it interacts with ethics, we need to answer a really important question. Where do laws actually come from? Because they don't just appear out of nowhere. There are specific systems and structures that create them. And understanding that helps you understand why certain rules exist, why some things are non-negotiable, and why this is how we've always done it is not a valid defense. So we're going to shift from what is law to how is law created. And this is where things start to connect back to real world regulations you already know, like CLIA, CAP, and institutional policies. Welcome to one of the most practical sections of this lecture, sources of law. Now, I know that sounds a little dry, but this is actually where things start clicking for a lot of students. Because this is where you realize the rules you follow in the lab didn't just come from your supervisor. They came from larger systems. And once you understand the sources of law, you start to see why certain procedures exist, why documentation matters so much, and why inspections always feel so intense. This section is going to connect those dots for you. So there are three main types of law that affect healthcare: statutory, administrative, and common law. And we're going to break each of these down because they show up in different ways. But before we do, here's the big picture takeaway. You are not just working under one set of rules. You are working under multiple layers of law at the same time. For example, laws passed by government, statutory, regulations from agencies like CLIA, which is administrative, and court decisions that shape practice, which is common law. And all of those influence what you can and cannot do in the lab. So when you think, why do we have to do it this way? The answer is often because multiple layers of the law say you do. First type is statutory law. This is probably the most straightforward. Statutory law is created by legislators, meaning elected bodies like state or federal lawmakers. These are written laws, also called statutes. So this is where things like state healthcare laws, licensing requirements, and scope of practice all originate. Now let's bring this into your world. If your state requires certain credentials to perform specific tasks, that's statutory law. If there are laws about how patient information must be handled, that's statutory law. And here's the important part. These are not suggestions. These are legally binding rules. So when you hear, this is required by law, most of the time you're talking about statutory law. Now, this is your everyday reality. Administrative law is created by regulatory agencies, not legislatures, agencies. And these agencies are responsible for taking those broad laws and turning them into specific, actionable rules. Examples you already know: CLIA, OSHA, CDC guidelines. And I want you to notice something here. This is very relevant to lab practice, like daily. CLIA tells you how testing must be performed. OSHA tells you how to keep yourself safe. CDC guidelines influence infection control. And your lab SOPs? Well, those are often built directly from these regulations. So when you're following procedures in the lab, you are actively practicing administrative law. You just didn't call it that before. Last type, common law. This one is a little less obvious day to day, but still incredibly important. Common law is based on court decisions. So instead of being written by lawmakers or agencies, it develops over time through legal cases. And it's built on something called precedent, which basically means what happened before influences what happens now. So if a court rules a certain way in a healthcare case, that decision can influence how similar cases are handled in the future. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how does that affect me in the lab? Here's how. Many standards of care, especially in negligence cases, are shaped by past legal decisions. So even if you've never read a court case, those decisions are still influencing expectations of your practice. Zoom out for a second. Healthcare is shaped by laws, regulations, and court decisions, not just the policies sitting in your lab binder. And this is where students have that oh moment, because it explains why things feel so structured and, to be honest, sometimes rigid. Your lab policies didn't just come from your supervisor. They are influenced by statutory law, administrative regulations, and legal precedent. So when you think, why do we have to document everything? Why are inspections so intense? Or why can't we just do it this easier way? Well, because multiple layers of law are behind those expectations, not just preference, but actual legal structure. Right. Let's bring this fully home. Think about your daily environment. We have CLIA standards, there's CAP inspections, and there's lab SOPs. These are not random. That is administrative law in action. Okay? CLIA tells labs what is required. CAP comes in and says, prove it. And your SOPs translate those requirements into step-by-step practice. So when you're checking identifiers, following processing protocols, and documenting everything, you are not just doing your job. You are meeting legal standards, supporting patient safety, and protecting yourself professionally. And here's the key takeaway. The lab is not separate from the legal system. It is part of it. Every slide you cut, every block you embed, every label you verify, you are operating within that system. Right. Quick gut check. Which type of law affects you the most every single day? If you said administrative law, hello, CLIA, then you are absolutely right. Because let's be honest, you are not thinking about statutory law while embedding tissue. You are not thinking about court precedent while cutting sections. But you are following CLIA requirements, working under OSHA safety rules, and being evaluated by CAP standards. That's administrative law running the show. And this is why this matters. Because the laws that impact you the most are not always the ones you see. They're the ones built into your daily workflow. So now that we understand what law is, where it comes from, let's answer the next big question. Who actually makes these laws? Because laws don't just magically appear. There's a structure behind them. And understanding that structure helps you understand why rules exist, who enforces them, and where change actually happens. So now we shift gears a little and zoom out to the big picture. Welcome to the system behind everything. The structure of government is what allows laws to be created, enforced, and interpreted. And in the US, this system is divided into 3 branches, each with its own job, and this separation is intentional. It prevents any one group from having too much power. Now, I know this might feel like, oh gosh, a civics class, flashback. But stay with me, because this directly connects back to your lab environment. Understanding this is how you start to see where your rules actually originate and who is responsible for them. Okay, here's the breakdown. 3 branches of government. We have the legislative branch that makes laws, the executive branch that enforces laws, and the judicial branch which interprets laws. Think of it like a workflow, because you know I'm going to bring it back to the lab eventually. Legislative branch would be like someone who writes the protocols in the lab. The executive branch would be the people carrying out the protocol. And the judicial branch would be the people who step in when something goes wrong and says, did we follow the protocol correctly? Each branch has a distinct role, and together they create the full legal system that healthcare operates within. So again, this isn't abstract. This is the structure behind everything from CLIA to licensing to legal cases. Zoom in on the first branch, which is legislative. This is the group responsible for creating statutes or written laws. So when we talked earlier about statutory law, this is where it comes from. These are your lawmakers at both the state and federal level. And in healthcare, this includes things like state healthcare laws, licensing requirements, and scope of practice regulations. So, if your state says you must be certified to perform this test, that came from the legislative branch. And here's why this matters to you. Even though you're not sitting in a legislature writing laws, those laws define what you are allowed to do in the lab. So your scope of practice, your professional boundaries, those are not just workplace rules. They are rooted in statutory law created by the legislative branch. Okay, now let's talk about the executive branch. This is the group that enforces laws. So remember earlier when we talked about administrative law? Well, that is where it lives, or this is where it lives. The executive branch includes regulatory agencies, and this is where your world starts to feel very real. We're talking about CLIA, OSHA, CMS, which is the Medicaid, Medicare, CDC guidance. These are not suggestions. These are enforceable standards. And here's the key difference. Legislative branch says, here's the law. The executive branch says, cool, now we're going to make sure you actually follow it. And if you don't, that's when inspections, citations, fines, or worse come into play. So when CAP shows up and everyone suddenly starts double checking everything, yeah, well, that's executive power in action. Now let's talk about the judicial branch. This is the group that interprets laws. So when something goes wrong, and I mean really wrong, this is where things end up. The judicial system looks at what happened, what the law says, and whether the standard of care was met. And then they create precedent, which basically means what we decide here will influence future cases. So even if you're not personally involved in a lawsuit, decisions made in court can still impact lab policies, professional standards, and expectations of care. So yes, what happened in a courtroom somewhere else can absolutely change how you practice in your lab today. Okay, let's bring this all back to you, because this is not just theoretical. These three branches determine what you're allowed to do, what you must do, and what happens if something goes wrong. So let's make that real. Allowed to do is your scope of practice. What you must do is follow SOPs, safety, and quality standards. And if something goes wrong, there should be an investigation, discipline, or legal action involved. So when you're in the lab thinking, does this really matter if I skip this step? The answer is yes. Always yes. And now you know why. Because your actions are not just tied to your lab. They're tied to an entire legal structure behind the scenes. Okay, deep breath. Now we move into the part students either love or immediately get nervous about, and that is negligence. This is where ethics and law officially collide. Because up until now, we've been talking about systems, structures, and where laws come from. Now we're talking about what happens when something goes wrong, and more importantly, when someone is held responsible. This is where small decisions can have big, big consequences. So if you've been thinking, okay, but how does this actually apply to me? This is it. Welcome to tort law, aka the legal world of civil wrongdoing. This is not criminal law. No one's going to jail here, but someone can be held legally responsible for harm. And negligence is one of the most important concepts in healthcare law. At its core, negligence means someone failed to meet the expected standard of care and harm occurred because of it. Now, let's translate that into histotechnology. Think about a mislabeled specimen, or a contaminated slide, or even skipping a critical processing step, or reporting inaccurate results. These are not just oops moments. If harm results, well, that can become a negligence claim. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most negligence cases don't come from people trying to do something wrong. They come from rushing, cutting corners, not following protocol, and assuming something is good enough. Sound familiar? So as we move forward, we're going to break this down even further. Because understanding negligence is not about scaring you. It's about protecting you, your patients, and your practice. Let's slow this down and make sure we really understand this. A tort is a civil wrong that results in harm. Not criminal. No one's getting cuffed and taken out of the lab in handcuffs. But someone can be sued. That's why I label this lawsuit territory. Now let's make this histotech real. If a specimen is mislabeled, or if tissue is lost, or if a slide is processed indirectly and leads to a misdiagnosis, well, that's not just a lab mistake anymore. That can become a tort because harm can occur downstream, even if you never see the patient. And that's the key takeaway here. You don't have to touch the patient to impact the patient. So why does tort law even exist? It's not just about punishing people. There are three main purposes. Number one, compensation. If someone is harmed, they deserve to be made whole, or as close as possible. Number two, accountability. People and organizations are held responsible for their actions. No hiding behind, it was just a mistake. And number three, deterrence. This is the big one. The system is designed to prevent future harm. Now let's connect this to the lab. When policies get stricter, when documentation gets more intense, when there are 47 checkpoints for one process, that's deterrence at work. Those systems exist because something went wrong somewhere at some point. Now let's zoom in on negligence. This is the most common type of tort in healthcare. Negligence means failing to act the way a reasonably prudent person would. And I always tell students that phrase, reasonably prudent, is everything. It means not perfect, not superhuman, just competent, careful, and professional. Also important, negligence is not intentional. You didn't mean to harm anyone, but harm still happened. And legally, intent doesn't erase impact. So in the lab, negligence often looks like skipping verification steps, rushing through embedding or sectioning, or not catching an obvious labeling error. So not malicious, but still harmful nonetheless. You remember one thing from this section, let it be this. Negligence equals carelessness that causes harm. That's it. Pure and simple, but definitely powerful. Because carelessness doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like, I'll fix it later. It's probably fine. I've done this 1,000 times. Sound familiar? The problem is, in histotechnology, small shortcuts can have big consequences. But everything we do is part of a diagnostic chain. And if one link is weak, the whole chain is affected. All right, here's the structure piece. For negligence to exist legally, all 4 elements must be present. Let's break them down. Duty is number 1. You had a responsibility. In our world, you are trained and expected to follow lab standards and protocols. Number 2, breach. You failed to meet that responsibility. Skipped a step. You did something incorrectly, or you didn't follow SOP. Number 3 is injury. Harm occurred. This could be patient harm, misdiagnosis, or delayed treatment. And number 4 is causation. This is the big one. Your action directly caused the harm. Not just something went wrong, but your specific action is linked to the outcome. And here's the key teaching moment. If even one of these is missing, it's not negligence. But if all 4 are there, that's when things move into legal territory. Okay, let's break down the first element, which is duty. This is your legal obligation to provide care. Not optional. Not if I feel like it today. This is built into your role the second you step into that lab. Now, here's what students sometimes miss. Duty isn't just about doing your job. It's about doing your job to the accepted standard of care, meaning following protocols, following training, following institutional policies, or meeting professional expectations. And in histotechnology, your duty exists even though you don't directly interact with patients, because your work directly impacts diagnosis. So yes, you absolutely have a legal duty, even if you never leave the lab. Let's bring this into our world. What does duty actually look like in the lab? You are responsible for correct labeling. This is non-negotiable. Wrong label equals wrong patient equals catastrophic potential. We are also responsible for proper processing. So fixation, dehydration, embedding, all of it matters. You don't get to say, it'll probably be fine. Also, accurate documentation. If it's not documented, then legally it didn't happen. And here's the big takeaway. Duty is everything you are expected to do correctly. It's your baseline. It's the standard you are held to, whether anyone is watching or not. Now we move into breach. This is where things go wrong. A breach is a failure to meet the standard of care. So we had duty, and now that duty wasn't fulfilled properly. And here's the important distinction. It's not just that a mistake happened, it's that the mistake fell below what a reasonable professional would do. So not I had a bad day, but a trained histotech should have known better. That's the legal lens. Now let's make this real, because this is usually where students go, oh, yikes. Examples of breach in the lab would be ignoring unclear labeling. So say if something looks off and you just proceed anyway, well, that's a breach because a reasonable person would stop and verify. How about skipping protocol steps? I've done this 1,000 times. I'll just skip ahead. Nope, that's textbook breach because protocols exist for a reason and deviation increases risk. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most breaches aren't dramatic. They're simply small decisions, tiny shortcuts, moments where someone chooses not to slow down. Now we get to injury, and this is critical. Harm must occur because legally, no harm means no case. You can have a mistake, a breach, or even poor practice, but if no one is harmed, it doesn't meet the legal threshold for negligence. Now, in histotechnology, injury might not look obvious at first. It could be misdiagnosis due to poor staining, or delayed diagnosis due to lost tissue, or inaccurate results due to processing errors. And here's the key. The harm doesn't have to happen immediately. It can be downstream, days later, weeks later. So when you're working in the lab, remember, you are part of a chain. An injury happens when something in that chain breaks. Okay, final piece of the puzzle is causation. This is the one students think is simple, and then it gets tricky real fast. Your action must directly cause the harm, not kind of related, not maybe contributed a little. It has to be linked. Think of this like the chain again. Duty, breach, injury, causation is the link that connects them. In histotechnology terms, let's say you mislabeled a specimen. That specimen got processed. The wrong diagnosis was made, and the patient received incorrect treatment. That's causation. Your action directly led to harm. But here's where it gets interesting. If something breaks that chain, causation disappears. And without causation, no negligence case. So causation is really asking, can we prove this mistake caused that harm? If the answer is yes, you've got a problem. Let's zoom out for a second, because this is the part where everything starts to click. No harm equals no lawsuit. No causation equals no case. You can have a mistake, a bad decision, or even a clear breach. But if there's no harm, legally, it stops there. And if harm did happen, but we can't prove your action caused it, still no case. But if all four are present, duty, breach, injury, and causation, well, that's when things get very, very real. This is why negligence cases are so specific. It's not about, did something go wrong? It's about, can we prove all four elements? And in the lab, this is why documentation, protocols, and verification matter so much, because they either protect you or become evidence. Right. Now we're shifting gears into something huge, and that is standard of care. If you take nothing else from this section, take this. Everything we just talked about, duty, breach, negligence, all of it revolves around this concept. Because the question is always, what should a competent professional have done? Not what you felt like doing, not what your coworker does, not what you saw once on TikTok. The standard of care is the benchmark. It's the expectation. It's what the profession says is acceptable practice. And in histotechnology, this comes from training, protocols, accreditation standards, hello NACLS, regulatory requirements, there's CLIA again, making an appearance. So moving forward, everything we talk about gets measured against this standard. So let's define it clearly. The standard of care is what a reasonably prudent person would do in the same situation. Not a perfect person, not a superhero histotech, a reasonable, competent, trained professional. This matters because the law doesn't expect perfection, but it does expect consistency, competence, and sound judgment. So when something goes wrong, the question becomes, would another trained histotech have done the same thing? If the answer is no, now we're getting into breach territory. And here's the kicker. Your experience level doesn't lower the standard. Students, new grads, seasoned techs, you're all held to a professional standard once you're performing the work. Okay, I need you to hear this one loud and clear. The standard of care is not your best guess, your coworker's shortcut, or, well, that's the way we've always done it. Because let's be honest, every lab has that one person who says, I skip that step all the time. That is not the standard of care. That is how people end up in court. The standard of care is the accepted, evidence-based, professionally supported way of doing things. So when you're unsure, your question should be, what is the correct accepted method? Not, what's the fastest way to get this done? Because in the lab, shortcuts don't just risk quality, they risk patience. And legally, they risk you. Okay, let's bring this out of textbook world and into your lab. Because when we say standard of care, we're not talking about some abstract legal idea floating out there. In your world, the standard of care means SOPs, policies, and best practices. This is your day-to-day playbook. These are the rules you're expected to follow whether someone is watching you or not. Think about it. SOPs tell you how to process tissue. Policies tell you what is required. And best practices tell you what experienced professionals know works safely. So when we ask, did you meet the standard of care? What we're really asking is, did you follow the procedures and expectations of your lab and the profession? And here's the important part. These aren't suggestions. They are documented, proved, and defensible. Meaning, if something goes wrong, these are the first things people look at. Now let's talk about what happens when you don't follow that standard. Deviation equals risk. every single time. If you deviate from SOPs, policies, or best practices, you are stepping outside the standard of care. Now, does deviation always equal harm? No, not necessarily. Sometimes people get away with it. But legally, that's playing with fire. Because here's the formula. If you deviate and harm occurs, well, that's negligence. Not just oops, not just a bad day, but negligence. So that little shortcut, that skipped verification, that I'll just fix it later moment, those are the exact moments that become legal cases or incident reports or root cause analysis. Let's make this real. Skipping ID verification. We've all seen it happen. Specimen comes in, you're busy, you think, I know what this is. So you skip full verification. You move it along. You save yourself a little time. Fast? Yep. Safe? Nope. Because if that specimen is wrong, everything downstream is wrong. Grossing, processing, embedding, sectioning, and diagnosis. Now, we're not talking about a lab error. We're talking about patient harm. And legally, that's high risk because ID verification is never optional. It is one of the clearest examples of standard of care in action. All right, now we're going to take this one step deeper because up to this point we've been talking about, did your action cause harm? But now we're asking, should you have seen it coming? This is where things shift from what happened to, was it predictable? Because in healthcare, and especially in the lab, we don't just react to problems. We are expected to anticipate them. So now we're connecting action equals harm equals predictability. And this is where negligence cases get even more interesting. Okay, welcome to one of the most important concepts in negligence is causation and foreseeability. Causation asks, did your action cause the harm? Foreseeability asks, should you have known this could happen? And in the lab, this is huge because so many errors we see are not random. They are predictable, preventable, and repeated. Examples: mislabeling leads to misdiagnosis. Poor fixation leads to poor staining. Skipping steps leads to poor quality slides. None of that is surprising. It's foreseeable. And when something is foreseeable, you are expected to prevent it. So moving into this next section, we're going to break down how the law looks at predictability and how that applies to lab practice, as well as why I didn't think it would happen is not a strong defense. So let's zoom in on causation, because this is where we stop talking about what went wrong and start asking, did your action actually lead to harm? Causation is not about being involved, being nearby, or being on shift. It's about connection. There has to be a clear link between what you did and what happened to the patient or specimen. In histotechnology, this shows up all the time. For example, incorrect fixation results in poor morphology. Improper processing results in tissue distortion. In floaters, results in contamination, which can result in wrong diagnosis. If your action directly contributes to that chain, that's causation. And without causation, there is no case. So this is where the legal world gets very specific. Not just something went wrong, but who caused it and how. Now here's the tool used to figure that out, the but for rule. And it's exactly what it sounds like. We ask, would the harm have happened but for your action? Let's translate that into lab reality. If you're thinking, even if I didn't do that, the same thing still would have happened, then guess what? That weakens causation. But if the answer is no, if I hadn't done that, this wouldn't have happened, then we've got a problem. That supports causation. Example, you mislabel a cassette. The tissue gets processed incorrectly. Diagnosis is made on the wrong specimen. Ask yourself, would that harm have happened but for the mislabeling? Answer, nope. And that's exactly how causation gets established. Now let's layer in foreseeability. This is where we ask, could you reasonably predict harm? Not, did you intend harm or did you want harm? But, should a trained professional have seen the risk? And this is huge in histotech because most lab errors are not surprising. They are known risks. We are trained to know that mislabeling results in the wrong patient. Poor fixation results in poor interpretation. And skipping steps means compromised results. So when something goes wrong, the question becomes, was this predictable? If yes, responsibility increases. Because now it's not just an accident. It's something that should have been prevented. Let's put it all together. Mislabeling a specimen. Ask yourself, is harm predictable? Yeah, absolutely. Because we know what happens. Wrong identity, wrong tissue, wrong diagnosis. Next question, is it preventable? Also yes. We have systems in place, 2 identifiers, verification steps, and documentation protocols. So now we've got predictable harm and a preventable error. That is the exact combination that screams negligence risk. This is why labeling is taken so seriously. Not because it's annoying, not because it's repetitive, but because it is one of the most legally and clinically critical steps in the laboratory. This is your big takeaway slide. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember this. If harm is foreseeable, then responsibility increases. The more predictable the outcome, the more accountable you are for preventing it. In other words, I didn't think about it, or I was busy, or I've seen others do it. None of those hold up. Because as a trained professional, you are expected to anticipate problems, follow the safeguards, and prevent harm. And this is where lab practice becomes more than just technical skill. It becomes professional responsibility, ethical responsibility, and legal responsibility. And honestly, this is what separates someone who does the job from someone who practices like a professional. Okay, another quick gut check moment. If you're standing at the bench and you catch yourself thinking, this could go very wrong, that is not just anxiety. That is not you overthinking. That is foreseeability kicking in. Your brain is doing exactly what it's been trained to do. Recognize risk, anticipate consequences, and flag potential harm. And here's the key. That moment, that thought, That's your opportunity to stop the error before it happens. Because once you've recognized the risk, you're now responsible for responding to it. So when we transition into this next section, keep that in mind. Awareness equals accountability. All right, now we're shifting into something students always find surprising. Not all harm is treated the same legally. We break it into two big categories: intentional and unintentional, which is negligence. And here's the thing: most people assume legal trouble comes from doing something on purpose. But in healthcare, that is not the most common issue. The reality is, most problems come from things that were not intended, but still caused harm. So we're going to break these down because the difference matters a lot. Let's start with intentional torts. These are done on purpose. There is clear intent to act. Classic example would be battery, which in healthcare terms means touching or performing a procedure without consent. Now, bring that into a lab mindset. We don't typically think of ourselves as touching patients, right? But think broader: handling specimens improperly on purpose, altering results intentionally, or disregarding consent-related protocols. Those cross into intentional actions. And here's the good news: these are actually rare in the lab because most of you are not out here trying to cause harm. If you are, then we need to have a very different conversation. Now, this is where things get real. Unintentional equals negligence. This is no intent, but still harmful. And this is where most lab-related legal issues live. Because negligence looks like skipping a step, not verifying identifiers, rushing through a process, or assuming instead of confirming. Nobody wakes up and says, I'm going to mess up a specimen today. But it happens when standards are not followed. And here's the key point: intent does not protect you from responsibility. You can have good intentions, a busy day, or a heavy workload, and still be negligent. Because the expectation is you follow the standard of care every single time. All right, this is the mic drop slide. Most legal cases are from negligence, not intentional harm. Let that sink in. The majority of cases are not about malice, bad people, or intentional wrongdoing. They are about breakdowns in routine practice. Small things, everyday things, things that seem harmless in the moment, like not double checking a label, or skipping a verification step, or again, assuming it's probably fine. And that's what makes this so important, because the risk in this profession is not big dramatic mistakes. It's small, preventable ones, repeated over time. And that's why your habits matter. Your consistency matters. Your attention to detail absolutely matters. Because in the lab, unintentional does not mean no consequences. Okay, we've covered a lot, but this is where we pull it all together. This wasn't just a lecture about laws, or definitions, or legal terms. This was about how your everyday actions connect to real consequences. Because everything we talked about today, standard of care, deviation, causation, foreseeability, and negligence, all of it shows up in one place, and that is your daily workflow. So as you leave this section, I want you thinking, how does this change how I work at the bench? Because it should. But let's lock in the big ideas. Law defines the minimum standard, not the best practice, not excellence, the minimum acceptable care. Negligence requires 4 elements: duty, breach, causation, and harm. Miss one? It's not negligence. Hit all 4? Now it is. And lastly, lab work equals legal responsibility. Not just technical skill, not just following steps. You are accountable for outcomes. And that's what separates doing the task from practicing as a professional. And this is the one I want you to remember. In the lab, accuracy is not just technical. It is legal, ethical, and patient care. Every slide you cut, every stain you run, every label you verify connects back to a real person, a real diagnosis, and a real outcome. So when you're tired, when you're busy, or when you're tempted to cut corners, come back to this. Who is affected if I get this wrong? Because in this field, details are not small things. They are everything.